The theme is retransitioning, breaking the taboo, and is moderated by some message with our speakers Siri Landgren, Orlando Deya, and Sam Lindskog. Sam, pronounced they them, is an artist and community organizer based in Gothenburg. In their work, they explore how art and culture can be used to weave new connections between people in order to build a more diverse, inclusive, and sustainable LGBTQ plus movement. Siri Landgren, pronounced she, they, is an artist and writer. Her most recent project, Failing Identity, is an investigation and critique of the concept of identity and its application to politics and existential issues. Orlando, pronounced they, them, she, and he, from Titor Committee Gothenburg, is a visionary, non-binary, forever-changing, gender-fluid, burned-out trans activist, a bicycling poet, a radical mental health activist, and a flower-loving performer. Sam Lindskog, pronounced they, them, is occasionally a community organizer, but mostly just tired. They have resigned to never finding their true gender, but still forage for gender euphoria, deeper connection, and wild woods. In summary, as the moral panic around trans people continues to strengthen, we take a moment to discuss an often taboo subject, retransitioning. In doing so, we'll also question the concept of identity and its relation to binary thinking, as well as delving into transitioning as a fluid, changing, and continuous process. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. First, I just want to say a really big welcome to the stage, and thank you so much for taking the time to be here and to talk to us about this. We have got 45 minutes to get into some big and juicy topics, so let's get right into it. We have no time to waste. What I wanted to start is just talk a little bit about terminology and ask you what the word transition means to you, first and foremost. Do you want to start, Siri?
Okay, so I have a bit of a spiel on this, so forgive me if this is going to be my time spent. But I've been thinking a lot about the term transition, since I came out to the public 10 years ago. I heard it starting to be used, and I felt I couldn't identify with it, to use an interesting word, because I feel like the way we use the word transition in general language, at least back then, but probably still, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but we talk about it very much as a conscious choice that we make, I'm going to transition next year after I move, and that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. For me, it wasn't the case. For me, it was more like a gravity pulling me towards something. So it's framed as a conscious choice, that's something you do for a limited time, and then you're done, right? You've achieved something. You move from one point to another, and the starting point and the end point are well defined, so you can say what you were before and what you are after. Usually from one binary gender to another. That's the most conventional. And that also genders the point you started from, which might be what you don't want, right? So by using the word transition, you also gender your older self, which might be problematic. And it labels the starting point as somehow false. You weren't living as yourself. The destination is true, which might then be complicated if you later move to a different point. And that's okay, so was that true? Transition is supposed to be all-encompassing. You do the whole package. That's what's been assumed. And that's led people, as we will come to regret, because they've done things that are assumed that you will do as part of transition. Including medical intervention is kind of expected, or at least has been. And that transition is singular. You do one in your lifetime, and that's supposed to be, that gets you to the right place, and then if you realize you have to do something else, this is where this whole thing gets complicated, right? And this kind of gets solidified by healthcare and the evaluations that have to decide if you're either cis or trans. No in between. You get a diagnosis or you don't. You're binary or non-binary. You even get different diagnoses depending on if you're binary or non-binary, giving you different healthcare, and the whole true or false thing. And is the treatment right for you or not? There's supposed to be a simple answer to that. Okay. my thing on transition, what transition means and why it's complicated.
Would you like to respond to that, or does that resonate with you, Orlando?
That definitely resonates, but I would also add, to confuse it all, I'd add something to that, and that is, for me, we transition all the time, or we have different moments in life where we transition, and gender is one transition, age is a transition. There are many different kinds of transitions, and like, I wanted to talk a bit about my personal experience. I grew up in a very rigid family and a very rigid society. So when I was a young adult, and a teen and a young adult, I was heterosexual, feminine, cis woman. I was homophobic and transphobic. So, and I saw myself as a very open-minded person. But I never intended to, you know, I didn't think I was doing something bad. I just did what was around me. And then I got seduced by a girl and got, oh, wait a minute, my sexuality, what's, and it took me a couple of years to actually embrace that part of me. So after a couple of years, I became 100% lesbian or 150% lesbian, and I was super lesbian. And then I fell in love with a guy, and just fuck. And I had to come out as bisexual for myself and for others. And along that road, I started to test being more butch, and started to test masculinity. And I did a drag workshop. I saw a film called Venus Boys that totally changed something deep, deep within me. And it took me many, many years, and then I had this very masculine man part of me that I needed to reclaim and I needed to give space to. So I embraced my manhood, but people around me didn't do that. They still mirrored me as a woman. So I've had this urge of passing, and passing as a man. So then I took a decision to take hormones. And I think I wouldn't have started hormones if society and people around me would have just said, oh, okay, you're a man now, okay, and just mirrored me as a man. Then I wouldn't have the urge and need to actually change or transition physically. But I already transitioned within me. So, and then a couple of years on that, when I started to pass and I started to land in this manhood, I felt that, oh, that womanhood, I kind of missed it, and I missed my feminine parts, and I felt I never went from one to the other. I just tried different parts of me and explored them and embraced them. So then I needed to reclaim my feminine parts, and that's very much where I am today. I'm reclaiming my feminine parts, but I'm not rejecting my male and masculine parts. So for me, I transition now too. I'm retransitioning to something else. I'm embracing all parts of me. So, and I'm thinking, like, when we think about transition in age, for example, when you go from a child to a teenager, that's a huge transition. Or from a teenager to a young adult, that's a huge transition. And now I'm growing old, I'm 47, and my body is changing, my skin is changing. That's also a transition. So, and I'm thinking, I don't know who I'm going to be tomorrow. I just know who I am right now.
I think you bring up a really interesting point there around the societal pressure around our transitions, and this, we've spoken about this before, this idea of, you know, what if people had been able to treat me differently. But as we've talked about before as well, we don't live in that utopia. So it's important to recognize, you know, this is the transition that is, or these are the options that are available to us and the steps we have to take care of us. Yeah. But Sam, tell us.
I recognize things that both of you have said, particularly the thing about transitioning from something false to something true, and the impossibility of that. That's never been possible for me. Every step of the way, I've hesitated. about every step of the way. And at this point, I'd say I've transitioned at least twice. And my definition of transitioning would be when I change how my gender is perceived by others. Because my internal gender, or my understanding of my own gender, changes day to day, basically. But it's nearly impossible to live like that in the society. And similarly to you, also that the transitions of gender is what we're talking about today, but the transitions of sexuality and how that interconnects with gender. I've also been all of the things that you described. But yeah, so 2 transitions, if we simplify things.
It's okay, we don't have to simplify things. We're here for the nuance. And I think that's something that really resonates in all of your experiences you've mentioned, is this idea of nuancing this binary of this one-directional transition and what happens when we're shoehorned into, like, you're either going this way or you're going this way. And this panel is obviously about and detransitioning. And to kind of continue this discussion of terminology, I wanted to ask you, kind of, what are your relationships to these terms, or retransitioning? And what do you think the difference between these 2 terms is for you? Who'd like to go first? Should we go the other way? Sam, you can start, and then we...
Okay, I can start. I feel like there is some kind of consensus about detransition being used for people who go back to an original assigned gender, while retransitioned is used for people who are changing direction in some way. And retransition people often still identify as trans, while detransition people don't always do that. But honestly, I don't care what terms people use for themselves. I might use both. Retransition might feel a little bit closer to my experience. If you think of gender as a scale where you're just moving back and forth along it, then I am partially detransitioned. So I could also say detransitioned, but I would feel like I'm claiming a space that's not mine by using that word. So I think retransitioned is more accurate for me.
I totally agree. Couldn't have said it better. I maybe just want to add that, like, for me, retransition is more a movement forwards, and detransition is a movement backwards, back to what you were. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's something to that, because I was thinking, like, the prefix D is like in delete, you take something away, and that's probably what you use if you feel that your transition then was a mistake, right? You don't want to identify with having done that. You want to, that wasn't me, I was fooled, for example. But the prefix re is interesting because it means, like in Latin, both doing something again, but also like doing something in a more, like reinforce, doing something more forcefully, and that's interesting. Like, so maybe it could mean not only again, but further transitioning, which I think is interesting. But also to add that I've been really interested in this subject recently because I'm interested in anything that has to do with doubt, like you mentioned. I'm fascinated by doubt. And I've been talking to a friend who I think uses the word detransitioning about himself, and I asked what they would say if they could be here, because obviously this isn't perceived as a safe place for everyone, and this is a sensitive subject. And they mentioned things like they would have needed therapy before taking serious decisions about doing, like, taking hormones and stuff. More information about risks and side effects. Apparently they only talked about the aesthetic risks and side effects of operations. They wanted pushback and not just confirmation of who they were, which I think is kind of, in the light of the video that I made, is kind of rare for me, imagining getting confirmation from an evaluation. Not really my experience, but that, you know, it differs. Also, like, speaking of how it differs throughout the country. And they wanted more information about, or they wanted to be questioned about why they felt dysphoria, which I think is a really interesting question because it often overlaps with like fat phobia, for example, that you want to change things about your body.
I think that's a really great point to bring up, bring up that experience that this doesn't feel like a safe space for everyone to talk about, and there were people who did not want to partake in the panel because they don't want to talk about these issues publicly, and really nice that you could lift some of that voice. And I think that really just highlights how important it is to have appropriate healthcare that is on the terms of that specific person. You know, that's what they needed, but not what you needed. So making it on our terms. Thank you for sharing that. What we're going to be doing moving forward is diving into some of these central myths around this taboo of detransition and retransition. And before we get into that, I just wanted to give a quick introduction to kind of give some context to the panel. So, I want to say it right, so I've got my little printed out sheet here. I'm very prepared. The topic of de and retransitioning is something that has become weaponized within the anti-trans discourse. So here, the figure of the detransitioner is used as proof that trans healthcare needs to be even more regulated, even more restricted, and even outright banned. And there are a number of central myths used to support this position. First, I want to contextualize this conversation by busting what I think is the most one of the most foundational myths in this discourse, and that is the idea that there are many trans people who transition by mistake or who are tricked into transitioning and then are forced into detransition later. So to give you some statistical context here, the number of people who detransition is estimated between 1 and 2%. So when we're including retransitions, the most recent large-scale meta-analysis in Sweden does put a broader range on this figure, between 1 and 13%, and that includes a growing minority of non-binary people in this statistic. But the authors of this paper specify there's not enough data to narrow this when it comes to both de and retransitioning. However, when they talk about regret specifically, it's about 1 to 4%. So we are talking about a small minority, and further studies have shown that the majority of this small minority cite reasons including financial circumstance, pressure from society and family, and inappropriate funneling of, we're talking about this binary transition of going one way and then being funneled into these sequential actions, because this is what to be trans means. So I think that's some very important context to give. And it must also be said that gender-affirming care, as most of us here already know, has an incredibly high success rate in treating gender dysphoria and is vital in improving mental health of trans people. There is a mental health crisis in this community, and the suicide risk in our community is vastly higher than in the general population. So when detransitioners are used as a reason to prevent or limit access to gender-affirming care, we're using around 2% of potential patients to justify limiting or even denying healthcare to the 98% of other potential patients. It's incredibly important, however, that no one is failed by our community and no one is failed by society's healthcare structures. So even though they are a small minority, there are people who de or retransition due to regret or due to having realized that what was diagnosed as gender dysphoria can actually be attributed to, for instance, intense body dysmorphia or as the result of sexist societal structures. So these individuals must have a safe space to be able to explore that, as we in the community must all have the opportunity to explore our own identities on our own terms, free from taboo. Unfortunately, those who weaponize detransitioners as evidence against the efficacy of gender-affirming care do the harm that they pretend to fight against. They create this taboo. And that's why we're here in this panel, to break this taboo, because we're here to make a better, safer community for those who want to join and for that small minority who want to leave. So, now I've done my spiel, it's time to turn back to you and all of your expertise. And I want to circle back to this question about regret. So this idea is around when we transition, we're making some misguided decision and that we're going to do irreversible harm to us, which we're going to kind of regret into the grave. So I want to ask you, why do you think there is so much focus on regret in the anti-trans debate? Is anyone burning to start? Orlando, I've got eye contact with you.
Yeah, okay. Well, I think focusing on regret fuels the idea of the binary gender system. That it fuels this idea that there's only male and female, and that we go from one to the other or back. And we do need to also address that this binary gender system and this idea also fuels a pressure on the trans community to be binary, and doesn't leave space to rethink, to change your mind, and to evolve in a different direction. So I believe that the problem is not trans existence, but the idea of the two genders, that there's only two genders to choose from. And this idea that there's only one or two, there's only two genders to choose from might actually push some of us in the direction of taking life-changing decisions that we actually regret later. So I'd say that regret is a thing, but the root of regret is maybe not the trans community, but the binary oppressive system, basically.
I think it's interesting to talk about regret in the same way that it's interesting how the word irreversible has become like a catchphrase, because, I mean, everything is irreversible, right? Going through puberty on your body's own hormones is just as irreversible as going through puberty on hormones you add. And it's interesting with regret. I was thinking, do I feel regret? I'm not sure, but for me, regret somehow means I should have known better, and I'm not sure I should have, but I definitely feel grief about not having gone on estrogen earlier. If I had started estrogen at 21 instead of 31, my life would be so much easier. And that's also due to society and what's encouraged and what was felt like it was available. So, and I think that my grief about what hormones have done to my body probably feels the same as the grief or regret of those who now considers themselves detransitioned. And I think that's something, an interesting point to maybe meet at.
I need to collect my thoughts a bit. I think a lot about control. I think that the focus on regret is, in some part, a focus on who is truly trans and who is not truly trans. Because it's about you having a true internal identity that needs to be confirmed by someone outside of you. And now that trans is becoming a broader term encompassing more people, I think there's fear. And a way to reduce the number of trans people or to undermine the reality of our experiences is to say you're going to regret this because you're not truly trans. The true trans people know exactly who they are when they're 3 years old, and that whole narrative.
Yeah.
And I see a really strong parallel to control in society in general, where you think that by restricting something or punishing something, you're going to make it go away. And it's not going to work, clearly. But instead of doing support, we're restricting and forbidding and hoping that that's going to reduce the number of trans people and reduce the amount of crime, if I'm drawing that parallel.
Yeah.
It's really interesting that you mentioned control, and I'm thinking and also saying that you know who you are, because control and knowledge then make me think of Michel Foucault and how we always assume knowledge to be a good thing, and I'm not sure the people who know who they are they better off than us three? or 4. I don't know about you. But I mean, is it always good to know who you are?
Or is it possible? I mean, I think something I just wanted to circle back there to what you were saying about truly being trans. I think the really sinister narrative in this regret is also like how terrible if we accidentally trick one person into being trans, or one person accidentally becomes trans. That one person's, what we have done to them is worse than saving all of these other trans people. It's that balance, isn't it? But I'm just wary of the time, and I want to get through these juicy topics. So I wanted to move on to, what do I want to move on to? Yeah, no, I actually do want to continue with this regret thing because I have more great questions about it. Just pat myself on the back. We've touched a little bit on this, but I want to know from you, we're talking about there needs to be this place for regret in our community, and to be able to talk about that. How do we make space for that as a community? Big questions. Who's going to fix it?
I think places like this.
Yeah.
Open conversations, and hopefully public conversations, but that's a lot scarier, and I know we're going to get into that later, like the risks of open conversations about regret. But conversations in our bedrooms and our living rooms, and just being honest about the regrets we have, which I have many.
Related to being trans and not?
Particularly related to being trans, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we need to talk more about regret, and to talk about it on our own terms, and like to talk. We got so many diverse stories of who we are, our life journeys, and we all have different kinds of regrets in life, and everything comes with a cost, and we need to talk about it openly, so that also people who are in the beginning of their journey hear that, oh, this is possible, and this is possible, oh, and maybe I need to think about this, would I regret this? Because if we don't talk about it, then we give the idea that everything's going to be perfect, and it's never going to be perfect for anyone. Sorry, the world isn't perfect. So I think we really need to talk, and we also need to listen, to learn more how to listen. And I'm talking about in social media, in our living rooms, when we talk with friends, in open spaces like this, official spaces. We need to listen to people's stories without commenting, judging, putting our ideas on what that means. Just listen. Really, that's... I see a huge lack of listening often. Often we put in, oh, you have those feelings, that means that you are this and this and this and that. That is, and then you need to do this and this and this and that. And this like complete recipes of how to be trans, or how to not be trans, or how to be whatever. And I think that is super problematic, and I really would like to change that.
I think that's really a really important point, making these spaces where we can be honest and open without judgment, also from within the community. Do you have something to add to that, Siri?
Well, I'm thinking about this person that I was mentioning earlier, who's been talking about their detransition on social media, and how they've been reacting when me and other trans people have expressed gratitude and appreciation for their sharing of their story. How they've been like, I feel like they have been surprised every time that a trans people would be grateful for this and interested. And they've also said that this is probably due to that they see us as who they were in like 2014, which was like someone who condemned like any questioning as being transphobic. So they see their old self in us probably. Or that's what they said. And I think that's super interesting. I can recognize myself that the slightly like traumatized view of how you get proven like the opposite time after time, but you still can't believe that this group, for example, trans people can be friendly to you. I can relate to that with other things. So I think that's a really interesting example of how listening can take place and be needed.
For sure, and I think it's going to be very interesting to unwrap some of these questions about specifically this taboo. But I wanted to in this next little section, address what I think is another really important myth within this anti-trans debate around detransitioning, which is the idea that we cannot be trusted with our own identities. So here, the figure of the detransitioner is used as some kind of proof that we cannot know ourselves, and we therefore cannot be trusted with self-ID or informed consent on any kind of medical intervention. And I wanted to ask you, what do you think this myth says about how society sees us as trans people? Because I think it's very revealing.
No, wait. Say it again.
No worries. The question was about how do you think... I'm like, wait, what is the question? So the idea, the myth that we cannot be trusted with our own identities, what does this say about what society thinks about us as trans people?
Well, it says that we don't know our own good and that we can't trust our gut feelings and that we are not intelligent enough to understand who we are. And for that, we need an authority to guide us. And that is also the recipe of every single oppression. And like we have the church knows your own best, the government, the authorities, our teachers when we were in school, as kids, our parents knows your own best. We have this old school idea that I would like to change once and for all, that we should follow our leaders and then they will reward your obedience. And that's the same message that good old patriarchy and capitalism is giving us.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, it's time to take the power back, right?
Absolutely. Totally agree.
And I also would say that, like, being trans is rebelling this very idea of obedience. And just being who we are, our mere existence is rebelling this. So I think that is why hate and oppression is so hard and harsh against us. And because we really look inwards and try to listen to our gut feelings and be something, although everyone around us is telling us it's wrong. So I think, yeah.
Do either of you have some small words on this one so we can leave time for this taboo topic? What do you think?
Just a very simple answer to why we can't be trusted with ourselves is just turning that narrative around. Why can we trust cis people with themselves?
Yeah. Well, there you go.
But not us.
It is really interesting what kind of prohibitions are out there and not. Like, people have unwanted or unplanned pregnancies all the time, but if you want to get an IVF, for example, there's a huge amount of control. And also, the thing that I think it's like, we are already declared legally incompetent from the, not only so much focus on trans youth, but we are all declared legally incompetent. And like, to stress a point that I've been harping on recently, that when we get hormones from healthcare, it's not that the state is granting us healthcare, it's that it's lifting a restriction that it already imposed, because we can't do it on our own. So it's like, this is forbidden, and now I'm making an exception from the prohibition. So that's like, the prohibition is really categorical to begin with.
I think that's a really interesting way of framing it, actually, and not something that I've thought about. So that's really interesting. But to circle back to this taboo question, this idea we've been touching on of orthodoxy, what is correct to believe. We've touched upon how this has become a really sensitive topic, and I think partially that's because we in the community are really in a desperate fight to improve our access to this life-saving care. And this subject, the de or retransitioning, is a really key weapon in that anti-trans agenda. And I want to know about what happens to us when our experience become battlegrounds and what that means for us as individuals and as a community. So I wanted to know, have any of you feared or faced backlash in the community around this topic? Or perhaps, Siri, you also have some comments from some others as well.
I would say no, I haven't. But just like the person that you're somewhat representing today, I've feared it a lot of times. That thing of thinking of how I used to be quite judgmental and categorical and imposing that on other people around me and imagining them to be judgmental and categorical in their thinking. So I've feared it much more than it's happened. In reality, I think, and also if we're talking about the Rio detransition specifically, when I've considered it, if I've thought deeply about it, my fear is not of the community and their reactions, but the non-community, the non-trans people, because they are the ones who are going to judge me for being unreliable or crazy much more than the community will.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I totally agree, and I also want to add that I feel that I maybe can't talk openly because I am so scared that I will my words will harm the trans community and be used as a bat against us and against me also, like not being a reliable person, being a crazy person, and also I would like to add that in the broader perspective, the harder trans hate is outside of the community, the less space we have within the community to explore and change our minds and rethink, etc. And it can cause a backlash within the community because there's a backlash outside the community. And I think our biggest challenge is to keep being diverse and open and flexible and vulnerable, because that is our greatest strength, and it can also be used against us, but we should never stop being diverse and never never fall into this idea of a single story that this is how you're trans and this is how you are cis, or this is how you're a man and woman, etc. Just always be this very, very diverse, as we are. That's our strength.
That's an excellent point about what happens outside affects us inside, but also that our strength is this openness and this talking about it, and we cannot let that narrative control the narratives that we have.
No.
What about you, Siri? You have something to add here?
Yeah, I've felt a lot of pressure to conform to like the party line inside the trans community, and thinking about like why are we so afraid of being judged by, okay, maybe more by other people, but why are we so afraid of being like rejected by our community? And that's of course because we need our community so much. So it's a really tricky balance. We need to maintain a we that is strong, because we need to know that in this space I can feel safe, but also like we have to maintain this kind of diversity that you mentioned, because just to mention, I've been told by pretty prominent people in the trans community that you ought to know better or do better than this. I've been called undemocratic for making the video that you saw earlier by a pretty prominent member, because they didn't approve of me making the video. So there's been a pretty strong pressure to conform, which is kind of tricky to pair with our need to still maintain an us, right?
That's an interesting definition of democracy going on there. But that's a whole other panel, I suppose. Yeah, I mean, for me, it was also when I was asked about this panel, I was thinking, okay, this is a really controversial topic, and how can we talk about this in a way that is like both open but also safe to make sure nothing can be used against us? But Orlando, you look like you've got something to add there.
Yeah, I was thinking about like, I mean, I still haven't said much personal stuff about my regrets, for example, in this panel or in open spaces. I still don't feel I really dare to do it because there are so much judgmental ideas, and I just wanted to point that out. And that, like, whether I or detransition, I have a trans experience, and therefore I'm part of the trans community. Whether I transition or not, I have a part of womanhood because I have experienced, socialized as a girl. So I'm part of sisterhood too. So really, we should stop excluding each other from different spaces because we're part of what we have experienced and we're still part of that.
Absolutely.
And this idea of excluding, that is the very part of oppression, that is the very part of that's the biggest oppression that society does with us, is excluding us from the majority, from the warmth. So we really need to not exclude each other within the trans community. We need each other more than ever.
I totally agree. And also this thing that not the transitioners are such a small minority, but trans people in general are such a small minority. And we need to be able to build these bridges amongst ourselves and also with other movements, the feminist movement, anti-racist movements, and recognize those struggles also within our community. You look like you had a little word to wrap up this, okay.
I was probably just vibing.
Just vibing, good vibes. So we've got two little questions here to round off, or two parts to the same question, if you will. The first one is about talking to our community here today. And I would love if each of you could just give us one thing what is the one little summary thing that you want the community to take away from this discussion today? Easy question.
I can go. I had written down something. I'm not going to say that. I'm going to say a different thing. Something you said about doubt. It really made me think about how fascinated I am by doubt, and it's like I feel a really close affinity for doubt, probably. And then we were talking about regret, and I started thinking this is like my question, our research question for all of us. What is the relationship between doubt and regret? And also, like this thing about knowledge and not knowing maybe can be good sometimes. Can doubt be an aid to somehow lessen regret? Because I think you often regret if you've done things like rushed in or, I don't know, maybe. Can doubt be like a sort of a vaccine for regret? I'm not sure, maybe.
Well, I suppose it comes down to the fact that there's no room for doubt in the gateways that we go through are examinations in the sense that we have to pass them to move forward. So you say what you need to say to go. Orlando, what's your one point?
I like to say that there are many ways to transition and that not all want surgery or hormones, that we need to show that there are many ways. There's not one single way of being a true trans. There are many ways to be yourself, and we need to talk about it more. And there's many ways of being cis girl, cis boy, non-binary, trans, or whatever. And I think diversity is what I'd like to,
Embrace it.
Embrace diversity and listen.
Absolutely.
I'm going to echo that a little bit, but more focused on we feel a lot of fear, and we feel a lot of fear around having these conversations and maybe challenging ourselves when we're talking to each other to be brave and talk about it anyway, despite it being really scary to talk about regret and doubt and retransitioning. And I think and retransitioning is one of the most scary things you can do as a trans person. There are no established positive narratives of it yet. And I think we need those too.
Totally, I totally agree for that. And to wrap up, I want to know from you, what is it that you would say to those, same question here, but to outside the community, maybe even those who are more, how do you say, fientliga? Is that even a word in Swedish? I'm thinking in a language that I don't know exists.
Hostile?
Yeah, more hostile towards us. There we go. We thought it was going to be the other way around. I might be needing a Swedish translation. But what is one thing that you want those outside the community to take away from this conversation here? I'm only here to ask easy ones.
Flipping the narrative from control to support.
Yeah, I think we can get a round of applause to that. Excellent. Couldn't agree more. The challenge is on for both of you. We got a sound bite. What's next?
Yeah, I'd like to say that to tell the outside community that it is sexism, patriarchy, and capitalism that is misleading us, not the trans community. And I also would like to add that there's in this fear of this huge fear of, oh, there are so many who are changing now, who are being trans, coming out as trans, it's an epidemic and blah, blah, blah. And I would like to say, yeah, of course, that people want to run away from very narrow gender roles and gender boxes, because they're fucked up for everyone, right? So if people find a space somewhere where like, oh, here I can be a bit more myself, and they go there, then yay. That is just actually showing that something is fucked up here, and that we need to look on what's fucked up and not just being afraid and saying that it's something bad that people are, so many are coming out as non-binary and so many are coming out as trans. Yeah, no wonder.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Definitely. I'm thinking about the English term gender non-conforming, which is interesting because it's a way to be read as trans sometimes without being trans. It can be. And we don't really have a similar term in Swedish that I know. But it's interesting that what you run away from, you don't conform. So that's really understandable. I would like to say that we can't expect every life choice to be 100%, to be a success. That's not how life goes, like you said also. And we need to make choices, like you said, Sam. We need to make choices, make it possible for choices to be less drastic, to be more gradual, try things out. So we can maybe pull out if it's not good for us. So sometimes we make bad choices, all of us, cis people too.
Make an open space for that conversation. Well, I really want to thank you all for joining me on this panel and being open with your experiences and really daring to talk about this. I think it's really important. So I'd like to give a big round of applause to our panelists.